It is my great honor and pleasure to welcome to Bach Talk treasured friend and colleague Vedrana Subotic. Vedrana, thank you for joining us today. A common subject to all of my guests, our trajectory through our lives in music has been affected by Bach in very personal and particular ways. I'm wondering if you would share with me how you grew up with Bach.
Oh, I grew up on a constant Bach diet. My wonderful first piano teacher, whom I started studying with through the gifted music school program in former Yugoslavia at age 5, um, which was too early by general standards, but she took a liking to me. I was appropriately dressed in cute clothes and cute shoes, and her heart warmed to me, and she took me on as a student. And I studied with her for 10 years. And Svetlana, her name Svetlana Krchevina, she passed away when I was 15, very tragically, in the middle of our preparations for my first international piano competition. But that's another story. But Svetlana was a huge influence in my musical development because she was meticulous about providing for me the information on the progression of piano technique. So we started with Bach and Bach's method. I, very well remember my first piano lessons where she would line up my fingertips on the keys and would explain how to approach the black key and how to approach the white key and where the fingertips need to be. And this is all straight out of the Baroque treatise about piano playing written by his son. So we know a lot about how Bach taught his children through that. I was taught as if I was a Bach child, I feel like, because I played all the little pieces, and there hadn't been a week in my studies with Svetlana that had gone without a Bach piece. And I have taken the tradition now to my own teaching. All of my students, no matter what their level and trajectory is, are always studying Bach every single week. Bach and Bartok, those are my two teaching staples. You asked how Bach shaped my learning. I found Bach to be firstly a constant source of interest for me rhythmically. I talked a little bit about that versatility in the C sharp major prelude, the contours and the emphasis in different parts, and the asymmetry versus the symmetry. And so I found it to be just absolutely fascinating. I remember when I practiced the C sharp minor fugue from book 2, which is a very clear compounder. I found it absolutely fascinating to practice in a duple mode, right? And then I thought, well, why not practice it in fours? Yeah. So I found that Bach was so incredibly, intriguingly, mathematically engaging because of these possibilities of permutations, of groupings and hyperstructures that are not necessarily as simple to perceive as just looking at the written patterns, and the metric organization that he gives. There's always more. So that was something that intrigued me from the very beginning, albeit a very nerdy approach for a child. But I may have mentioned that we didn't really have television stations and classical radio. I learned from my own experience. We had a family friend who traveled back and forth between Moscow and Belgrade, where I was living at that time with my parents. And he would just go into a music store in Moscow and give them a box and say, fill this up with piano music, and they would. And so he paid for piano music by weight, I think, not necessarily what they threw in, but he would leave it. He wasn't a musician. He just wanted to bring me music as a gift because there was no opportunity to obtain it in Belgrade. And so he brought me pieces that I would not have come across otherwise, like Shostakovich preludes and fugues. It was hard to find at that time, and in former Yugoslavia, it wasn't exactly easily available. I learned by playing, by sight reading and playing. And so, the Well-Tempered Clavier was a daily staple of just sight reading and learning what Bach would sound like. And so and again, Svetlana was a wonderful and dedicated teacher, and she taught me the importance of really the meaning of legato, the illusions of legato on the piano, because I always tell my students, don't try to play staccato. Staccato is just bad legato. And everyone plays bad legato. That's not really an achievement. One doesn't have to try to play staccato. One just really has to try to play a better legato. Svetlana taught me how to listen to each tone in Bach's music and seek to connect it to the next. So not only with the finger motion, but with observing its decay and its acoustical properties. And because of that, I think for me, it's now easier to understand it's a string player playing Bach or a wind player playing Bach, or it's an organ performance. I hear it both in terms of its universality of application. Bach's music can be played on a kazoo and still sound beautiful. I also hear the nuances of each individual note as played by a different instrument. So I became very, very tactilely aware through this study of Bach, understanding how each finger has its own tone. And it's a contradiction a bit, because we are taught to make the same sound, right? We practice scales to make the same sound with our fingers. But then Baroque performance practice, the variety of touch, pedagogically, and we talked a little bit about that at some point, the length of contact with the key, if you will, very different from organ to harpsichord to any of the modern pianos. So being aware of all those nuances and developing that individuality of each finger, I think, there was a Bach Well-Tempered challenge, I think, where somebody posited the question of how did Bach influence Chopin? And, of course, there's that famous quote, Chopin stating that each finger has its own character. And I don't see that as being too different from Bach's writing. I find that to be true for Bach universally. And so that would have been, if I had been involved with that in that talk, that would have been my contribution. Svetlana also pointed out to me something that I think is often neglected in study of Bach's counterpoint, especially fugues, right, is the ability to understand the need for retaining suspensions for long enough so that we actually hear the sound continuing past and above the moving line above or below, because notes decay on the piano, but they do not decay if one is singing or playing oboe or Baroque flute and so on. So, they have the power to sustain those notes so that we can hear those beautiful 4/3s and 9/8 and whatnots. And we can't do that on the pianos. The emphasis, of course, on the harpsichord would have been agogic for those long notes, but on the piano, we have the capacity to plan the note ahead. And so planning ahead is another concept that I have learned because of this from studying Bach. Piano, as we know, is an instrument that cannot be modulated once touched. Once one touches the key, it's done. So we cannot, like our friends string players, adjust to what we're hearing. We have to plan it ahead of time, because there is no such thing as change afterwards. So that gives pianists, I think, a different responsibility as interpreters of music, one that is often neglected subject of teaching, having proactive playing rather than passive playing. Legato, listening to the sound, planning ahead, those are all things that sound simple enough, but to do them well, I think, requires time and dedication and persistence and perseverance. And the Well-Tempered Clavier is the mecca of all of those skills.
Svetlana not only contributed mightily to your development as a musician, she had something very wise to offer in terms of your development as a human being.
Yes, she wasn't just a piano teacher. She was a lovely and extraordinarily affectionate, well-read, worldly person with whom I had such good fortune of studying for 10 years. I remember the very early lessons when I was just a little child, she said, don't just practice the piano. Don't just spend hours playing on the piano. You have to engage in life in every way, and that it wasn't enough to just practice and be a good pianist. One had to have an internal richness of spirit and experiences. And so, as an example of this, sort of like a model for her ideology, she gave me Rubinstein's autobiography. I still have it. I still have this book from my first piano teacher, and I recommend it to my students all the time. Reading Rubinstein's account of his early years, he had some pretty unorthodox ideas about practicing and learning music on a train just from looking at the score. Those are kinds of things that are really inspiring. A 9-year-old. I'm thankful to Svetlana for telling me this, for teaching me in this way.
Again, entering Belgrade precociously.
University, yes, I precociously read all my textbooks in record time in high school and finished high school in 2 years. I had this epiphany in the first year that why wait to finish the biology textbook? It was interesting. And so I just read the whole thing during the first week, and then that led me to believe that maybe I should do that with the other textbooks as well. But again, that leads me back to Bach, because I think I told you my very first well-tempered clavier was the fugue, Prelude and Fugue in C minor from Book 1, and I had a learning epiphany during the practice of this piece. I wasn't, as children might be found, somewhat resistant to long hours at the piano, and so I would just do the bare minimum, as is probably pretty common, to prepare for the next lesson. And I was in the middle of learning the Prelude and Fugue in C minor. It was a new piece that Svetlana gave me. I was 10. And I loved it. And so I found myself practicing it for longer than the time that I had allotted to it, which, was something small, like maybe an hour. I was just learning it, and I was just practicing it, both the Prelude and the Fugue, in an hour, just sight reading it over and over again, which is not practice. But then I thought, well, I have some extra time and I like this piece. Why don't I play it for another hour? And at the end of that second hour, I was like, oh, it was an explosive revelation that if I doubled my practice time, I will exponentially double the quality of my playing. And this is where I realized that more practice equals better playing. I'm sure I was told this over and over again from, the tender age of 5 when I entered the music school. But as all of us who have children know, they learn on their own mistakes. Bach was my revelation about practicing and improvement and progress.
Turning you on to the whole idea of becoming a professional pianist, because yes, if you just extrapolate, gee, if I do this 6 hours a day, can you imagine?
Well, and I did. I ended up, deciding that that's a worthwhile pursuit, and I really fell in love with piano as an instrument and music about that age through the Prelude and Fugue in C minor, because I saw such a rewarding return on my attention and my time.
It's such a wonderful growing up.
The University of Belgrade was a wonderful school. I'm very fortunate to have had both the European and American perspective on training and musicianship. And I think it's given me a really well-rounded sense of training possibilities, and definitely training in Europe was the most formative part of my education. It comes back at me in ways that I would not expect. I am every day really grateful to my first piano teacher for taking me seriously, for taking my education seriously.
Well, and we are grateful to your sheet music angel in Moscow
Yes.
for getting your music by the box. And it's just so incredible because I think you were the one who created your whole sound world, your whole sound concept with your incredible sight reading in your very earliest days. And I'm just astonished by it. And I'm so honored by your remembrances.
Thank
Thank you
you
for being.
for letting me talk to you about all of that. It was a fun visit to my childhood.